Something people often ask about in regards to acrylic paints is how to manage the drying time. It's an important question. Acrylics are a water-borne media, and this means that, unlike oils, they dry by evaporation of the water in the paint, leaving behind a permanent, water-resistant acrylic film. The speed at which this evaporation occurs dictates the open working time of the paint. So, before you can truly master acrylics, you need to master the evaporation rate of the paint. And it's actually much easier than you may think. Tip number 1. Don't treat acrylics like oils or gouache. The first thing you need to understand before you begin with acrylics is to manage your expectations. If you are coming from an oil painting background, especially, like I did when I first began with acrylics, you are most likely going to need to adapt a new workflow. With oils, painters often pre-mix colors prior to beginning, which is also how I like to work with oils. Typically, I carefully pre-mix dozens of different colors ahead of time, and it's kind of a slow, almost meditative process. With acrylics, this workflow is really not the most appropriate in my opinion. I personally find that mixing colors as I go, kind of on the fly, works better with acrylic paints. If I were to carefully pre-mix colors like I do with oils, by the time I'm ready to start painting, some of those colors may have already begun to dry on my palette. Instead, I mix colors on demand, as I need them. When I first started with acrylics, I was worried I wouldn't be able to work quickly enough to match colors realistically. But in reality, I actually adapted to the acrylics quite easily, and I've become faster and more confident at mixing and matching colors. So if you can learn to embrace the drying time, it can actually become a really valuable asset. Tip number 2, consider a Sta-Wet palette. A lot of people advise using a Sta-Wet palette to control evaporation. You can DIY one with paper towels, or you can purchase one. When I first started painting with acrylics, I bought this Sta-Wet palette by Masterson. So basically, it's a plastic box with a lid, and inside you have a wet sponge and a piece of palette paper. This kind of palette has its advantages and disadvantages. In terms of slowing the evaporation of paint, they work quite well. The wet sponge helps raise the overall humidity around the paints, which keeps them from drying out quickly. If you need to take a break during painting, you can close the lid and the paint will still be fresh when you come back. I used this for quite a while, but I don't really like it very well. If you leave this sealed overnight, for example, the sponge starts growing mold. I also hate the idea of constantly buying and discarding palette paper. You can sometimes reuse the palette paper for a while, but after a few uses it will have absorbed quite a bit of paint, and it will need to be replaced. This particular palette I got is also a bit too large. It's quite bulky, and it's not the best choice if you don't have much desk space. So if you want one of these, I recommend getting one of the smaller sizes and maybe purchasing extra sponges that you can rotate out and hang to dry to keep them from growing mold. You can also make a DIY Sta-Wet palette with common kitchen items. The concept is similar to the Sta-Wet palette. A moistened paper towel acts like the sponge, and a piece of parchment paper replaces the palette paper. If you have a shallow tin with a lid or a similar type of plastic container, you can seal the paints to keep them fresh, just like the Masterson Sta-Wet palette. Personally, I decided to go back to my flat glass palette, just like I use with oil paints. I think part of the reason I don't struggle with dry time comes down to several other factors that relate to how I work, which I'll address coming up. Tip number 3, use a spray bottle. Probably the single most important thing I use to control evaporation is my spray bottle. After I set up my palettes, I like to gently mist the paints to keep them moist. For the spray bottle, you want to turn the dial to a very fine mist, which is what I find works best. And as I paint, if I notice the paint starting to feel sticky, I will periodically mist the palette again. These are super cheap to come by. I think you can get one of these for a few dollars. And in my view, they are an absolute necessity for acrylic painting. Spray bottles are also quite handy for painting large areas of continuous color, like in a sky, for example, and for painting smooth color gradients. There is a common misconception that it is impossible to paint smooth gradients in acrylics because they dry so rapidly. But if you mist the surface of the painting prior to beginning, it usually buys you enough time to get a smooth blended gradient. Pre-wetting the canvas also reduces the amount of water lost to absorption into the canvas. Keep in mind that highly absorbent surfaces like paper will have a drying effect, reducing the open working time of the paints. Tip number 4, use enough water with your paints. As I paint, I actually mix quite a bit of water from my rinse cup into my paints. In general, I like my paint to feel flowy, especially in the initial layers. Adding a little extra water not only helps the paints flow and glide across the surface, it also helps slow the dry time. I save the very thickest paint for the top layers and for final accents, which helps them stand out and have the greatest impact. Tip number 5. Wait a second, hold on. So I just want to back up for a minute, because as I was watching this back, I realized that I kind of skimmed over a few things and I want to clarify things a little bit. So in a lot of these clips that I've been playing, you'll see that I use quite a bit of water sometimes with my acrylic paints. Some people might even say too much water. And it's kind of a matter of polite controversy in the art community. So the problem with adding too much water to acrylic paints is that you can potentially disrupt the bonds in the acrylic paint film, leading to a painting that is less archival. Now, every paint brand is different, and every paint brand has different recommended dilution ratios. So for example, I have some paints here by Turner, and in the side is a leaflet, and they recommend not exceeding more than 2 parts paint to 1 part water. Usually you can find this on the packaging or on the paint brand's website, and it's never exactly the same. So I guess that I like to push the boundaries a little bit because I do sometimes exceed the recommended dilution ratios. So I'll do that sometimes on small things that are for practice or just for my own enjoyment. But I would say that if you're doing really important work for clients, for example, you should stick more closely to the recommended dilution ratios or use an approved acrylic medium or extender, because those will not disrupt the bonds when used correctly. So I really just wanted to talk candidly in this video about how I actually work. And the way that I like to work is just that, the way that I like to work. It's not necessarily the best way, or sometimes not even the technically correct way. It's all about finding the techniques that work best for you. And in this video, I really did try to come up with a variety of techniques to present here, not just ones that I like, because I want to help you find the techniques that help you work best. And that's going to be different than what I do. So I hope this helped clarify things a bit. And now we can move on to tip number 5. Consider using heavy body acrylics. Generally, I use quite thick, heavy body acrylics. The two brands I use most frequently are Liquitex Professional Heavy Body and Golden Heavy Body acrylics. These two brands are both really great, and I use them interchangeably. I personally don't care too much for soft body paints and fluid paints, but ultimately it's a matter of personal taste. In terms of dry time and evaporation, if you use fluid paints, they're naturally going to spread out over a larger surface area on your palette and evaporate more rapidly. This is just because more of the paint surface is exposed to open air, which accelerates drying. Heavy body paints stay in a compact pile naturally, which helps retard their drying, because less of the surface area is in contact with air. Professional grade heavy body acrylics also tend to have a higher pigment load than student grade paints or other soft body paints. And while this is not a deal breaker, heavy body paints give me a bit more flexibility to add water as needed, because they have that higher pigment load. Softer paints usually have a lower pigment load, and I'm not saying that they are bad paints, but they do tend to become a bit weaker as water is added, and they lose some of their potency. So just keep in mind that you can always take a highly pigmented, heavy body paint and add water to make it more fluid. But you can't really take a fluid paint and turn it into a heavy body paint. If you do still use highly fluid paints, I recommend trying a palette with wells or paint cups to keep the paints contained, so that they don't spread out and dry on your palette before you have a chance to use them. Or, of course, a Sta-Wet palette like we mentioned before can help you manage that too. Tip number 6 is to use enough paint. So just by putting out enough paint on your palette, you're going to help slow the evaporation. This idea goes hand in hand with the previous technique, in that a larger pile of paint is just naturally going to evaporate slower than a small pile of paint. It's really hard to overcome this fear of wasting paint, but if you can learn to put that to the back of your mind, you are going to be much better off. Tip number 7 is to consider the environment around you. So if you tried the previous techniques and you're still struggling, you might consider the environment around you, like temperature, humidity, and airflow. If you're working outside in the sun, when it's pretty hot outside, obviously the paints are going to dry faster than if you're working inside. Higher temperatures in general are going to have a drying effect. Also, if your climate is particularly dry, you may find that a humidifier can help. Generally, I find that average indoor humidity is perfectly sufficient for acrylic painting. So if the humidity level feels comfortable to you, it's probably just fine for painting. I don't think it's necessary to turn your house into a sauna, and it's not going to be comfortable for you or good for your home and furnishings. Also, if you like to run fans while you paint, keep in mind that this is also going to speed up evaporation, because it's going to increase the rate of air exchange. Heaters and air conditioners will also have a drying effect. But I always recommend putting your own health and comfort ahead of the paints, because that is really what is most important. If you're not comfortable in a space, you're not going to have a good time painting. And so you're not going to do as well. For me, a typical painting session is at least 1 hour up to a maximum of 4 or 5 hours. Using a spray bottle and some of the other techniques I mentioned here, I'm usually able to keep the paint workable for the entire painting session without resorting to paint retarders or other additives. But if you are still interested in slow drying paints, Golden also manufactures a line of slow drying acrylic paints called Open Acrylics. Personally, I view the rapid dry time of acrylic paints as a valuable asset. And I don't want to add a lot of products or additives to radically change that. Part of the reason why I switched from oils to acrylics was because the dry time of acrylics gives me a greater sense of control and flexibility. My colors are cleaner and brighter, I can finish a multi-layer painting in a single day, and I don't have to deal with the mess of oils. So from my perspective, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to try to turn acrylics into oils. If I wanted that, I would just use oil paints. So if you've tried all of these things and you still struggle with dry time and you still don't like acrylics, then acrylics just may not be the right media for you. Everyone has different working methods and preferences, and that's perfectly okay. Luckily, there are many types of paint on the market today, and they're all really wonderful, like oils, watercolors, gouache, and more. So it's just a matter of finding the paint that works best for you and your circumstances. I think acrylics are a wonderful media, and I hope this video helps you master the dry time of your acrylics.